The sound of metal slamming against asphalt has a very specific quality when the object is thrown with vicious intent, rather than just dropped. It's not the clumsy clatter of a tool slipping from a tired grip, but the violent, deliberate strike of someone who wants the impact to shatter the room. The heavy crescent wrench echoed across the estate's massive courtyard, with that terrifying clarity, and lay dead still in the dirt, while the suffocating silence that followed was crushed by the heavy breathing of 15 grown men who had absolutely no idea where to look. The veteran mechanics were leaning against their heavy-duty pickup trucks and the steel fencing, radiating the defeated posture of experts who were called in to neutralize a threat and hit an absolute brick wall, not because they lacked the skill, but because they had run into a monster they had never faced before. The massive commercial tractor sat paralyzed dead center in the yard, projecting the eerie, silent grandiosity that giant iron beasts carry when their hearts stop beating. A silence that is almost more menacing than their roar, because it violently exposes exactly how deeply we depend on them. The woman sitting in the wheelchair remained completely motionless, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes locked onto the dusty asphalt right in front of her footrests. Her gray work apron was faded and stained across the lap from years of grueling, invisible labor, and the metal push rims of her chair, where her hands naturally rested, were worn completely smooth at the top. The undeniable, polished scar of relentless physical friction applied with exact pressure, every single day, for a very long time. A hand thrust into the frame from the side, manicured nails, flawless polish, and the heavy, expensive weight of a massive diamond ring on the finger that was pointing with the furious, shaking precision of a predator, making sure her gesture was interpreted as a death sentence. "Did you see that?" Her voice sliced through the heavy air with the ice-cold venom of someone who wasn't screaming out of panic, but pure, calculated sociopathy. Because projecting that kind of volume in that specific environment was her way of violently asserting absolute dominance. 15 men, the best operators in the county, and not a single one of them could crack it. And you? A pathetic cripple who can barely roll herself around, actually think you are going to solve it? Spare me your psychotic delusions. Get back in the kitchen and wash the dishes, because that is literally all you are good for. Helen didn't say a single word. The mechanics standing around them stayed dead silent too. A few of them slowly shook their heads, carrying the heavy, cowardly shame of men absorbing a brutal injustice they desperately wished they hadn't witnessed. Not a single one of them lifted a finger to stop it. But to fully grasp how these people ended up bleeding out in that courtyard at that exact moment, we have to rewind. We have to start exactly where Helen started every single day. In the pitch black, 4 hours before the sun even thought about coming up. The alarm clock buzzed at 4 a.m. In a cramped room that carried the ironclad dignity of a small space organized with fierce military precision. Not the pathetic resignation of someone who accepts having nothing, but the lethal intelligence of a survivor who knows exactly how to make a little go to war. The cot had been aggressively made the second she got out of it, because Helen learned decades ago that waking up in a locked-down, organized bunker was the razor-thin line between starting the day with total clarity and waking up buried under chaos. The cheap closet held exactly 2 washed and ironed uniforms, folded with the exactness of a woman who spent years understanding that how you maintain your armor communicates exactly how much you respect the war. Her wheelchair sat right next to the bed, parked in the exact coordinates she had left it the night before. Over the years, she had optimized the brutal physics of the transfer, not with the slow, depressing struggle that outsiders usually project onto it, but with the violent, functional speed of a woman who knocks this out before coffee, before dawn, before the world even wakes up. It was just a mechanical phase of her morning protocol, no different than tying a combat boot. The push rim of her chair had been worn down to the bare metal at the top, a slow decay she had been fighting for over 2 years. She noticed the exact week the grip started to fail, ran the brutal financial math on a replacement set, realized the numbers were a total bloodbath, and just kept grinding on the bald rims because the chassis still rolled, and she refused to complain about surface damage when the core structure was still holding. The coffee was black as crude oil and taken standing up, or rather sitting completely frozen, gripping the mug on the edge of the tiny kitchenette counter. It was the only 60 seconds of the entire day where she allowed her brain to idle, and she protected that minute of silence with the hyper-aggressive violence of someone starving for peace. 2 buses. The first roared away just past 5:00 a.m., burning 40 minutes to hit the central transit hub. The second dropped her at the jagged lip of a dirt county road, where she had to manually muscle her chair through the gravel for the final grueling mile up to the estate's iron gates. That worn metal rim made this mile a living hell when the dirt was baked dry and hard, and an absolute nightmare when it rained, because the friction died completely, and her torn shoulders had to absorb every ounce of the torque. She never breathed a single word about that brutal mile to anyone on the ranch, because she had learned in the trenches that mentioning your pain is always translated by the rich as begging for a handout, and she didn't roll up to that gate to beg for a damn thing. She had secured the job at Charles and Sonia's sprawling estate 6 years ago. The gig was flagged by a neighbor who heard the rich folks up the hill were hunting for a ghost to scrub their floors, and Helen had rolled up to the service gate the very next morning, beating every other applicant. She wore a flawlessly ironed uniform and handed over a handwritten letter that ruthlessly detailed exactly what she had survived, and exactly what she was capable of executing. Charles had looked down at her with the cold, calculating stare of a CEO running a cost-benefit analysis. He fired off 3 direct questions, caught 3 bulletproof answers right back to his chest, and told her to clock in on Monday. Sonia had corners her during that very first week, dropping a thinly veiled threat disguised as advice, stating she fully expected Helen to keep up with the aggressive pace of the estate. It was a sentence that sounded polished on the surface but bled with toxic condescension. The arrogant assumption that a woman in a chair was inherently defective, and that Helen's competence would be violently scrutinized every single second she breathed their air. Sonia was 52 and had married Charles long after the ranch was already printing millions, dragging into the marriage a specific set of toxic habits forged in a trust fund family that had always shielded her from ever touching real, jagged adversity. She wasn't brain dead. She was a woman whose entire intellectual capacity had been aggressively hijacked to manage her own fake social image, which she treated as her most fragile and priceless asset. Her designer wardrobe was curated with the psychotic obsession of a museum director. Her hair was locked into place by a private stylist who drove up the mountain every Thursday. Her opinions were fired off with the blind, arrogant certainty of a tyrant who had never been punched in the mouth for being wrong. She would pace the hardwood floors screaming into her iPhone about incompetent peasants with the sociopathic ease of someone who doesn't care that the volume of her voice is hitting the exact people she is trashing, or worse, knows exactly who is listening and gets off on it. While she barked into the phone, Helen would quietly sterilize the marble countertops in the background, using a rag she had hand-washed that morning, because she knew that leaving dirty gear lying around projected weakness, and projecting weakness in a war zone like this estate was begging for an execution. Sonia never once made eye contact with her while she talked. It wasn't even an active insult. It was simply the terrifying reality that Helen did not exist on Sonia's radar, which was a microscopic scope permanently locked onto wealth and social leverage. Her brutal orders were just hurled blindly into the air, with the arrogant expectation that the ghosts in the room would catch them. And they usually did, because Helen had developed the hyper-vigilant radar of a survivor who learns to read the room so she never gives the sniper a reason to pull the trigger twice. The massive commercial tractor had flatlined 2 days before the most critical dinner party Sonia had ever orchestrated for her circle of friends. A pack of elite vampires who basically functioned as paid mirrors, reflecting Sonia's delusional superiority complex back at her with the reliability of a subscription service. The dinner was the social nuke of the quarter. It had been plotted with the ruthless logistics of a military invasion. The imported menu, the custom floral architecture, the exact vintage of wine to flex wealth, the designer armor she and Charles would wear, and the guarantee that the sprawling, hyper-profitable ranch in the background would scream generational money to everyone at the table. A dead, multi-ton piece of iron rotting dead center in the main courtyard was absolutely not part of the PR narrative. Sonia had cornered Charles in his private study the second she caught wind of the breakdown, dropping her orders with the aggressive volume of a woman who firmly believes that screaming faster and louder dictates how quickly the world obeys her. I absolutely refuse to be the laughingstock of this county over a piece of rusted junk. She spun on her heel to storm out before she even finished the sentence, because this wasn't a conversation, it was a dictation. Call every elite mechanic in the state, throw a blank check at them, but I want that eyesore running. I don't want your pathetic excuses, I want a running engine. Charles had executed the order instantly, because in 2 decades of surviving that marriage, he had learned that fighting some battles carried a collateral cost that simply wasn't worth the scorched earth. He called the mechanics. They rolled up the mountain in waves the next day, 1, 2, 5, 10, and finally 15 by sundown. Each guy hauling the perfect diagnostic tool for the ghost problem Charles had described over the phone, only to hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall the second they popped the hood. The John Deere 9R was a multi-million-dollar beast running on a generation of proprietary tech that most of the local grease monkeys hadn't even read the manuals for yet. It was a terrifyingly complex matrix of integrated electronics, advanced hydraulics, and heavy iron that talked to itself using encrypted corporate protocols that completely froze out conventional aftermarket diagnostic scanners. The mechanics threw every trick they had at the firewall. They slammed into the absolute limit of their knowledge base. And that crescent wrench hit the asphalt with the sickening sound of 15 proud men silently admitting defeat without having a clue why they lost. Helen had quietly observed the entire bloodbath unfold throughout the day. Not by standing around staring, she just kept grinding through her brutal daily protocol, ghosting back and forth across the courtyard between the main house and the service wing, executing her route with such perfect invisibility that not a single mechanic realized she was running a high-level tactical threat assessment on them. But she was. With the razor-sharp eyes she had forged over a lifetime of being forced to survive purely on observation, she absorbed the data, logging every single diagnostic code the mechanics tried, identifying the exact brick wall where each man broke, analyzing the failure pattern that proved none of these supposed experts had even touched the actual root cause yet. She kept her mouth completely shut. Not because she doubted her own intel. It was pure environmental survival. 6 years in that toxic compound had taught her that speaking out of turn carried a massive, bloody tax, and she was aggressively calculating the exact cost-benefit ratio of stepping into the crossfire. She waited in the shadows until the math heavily favored pulling the trigger. And when Sonia finally thrust her manicured finger and shrieked those toxic, humiliating insults about washing dishes and delusions, the timer hit 0. Helen slowly raised her head. The first mechanic had rolled through the iron gates the following morning, radiating the arrogant swagger of a guy who charges top dollar because he knows he's the apex predator in his field. He was a 40-year-old operator wearing a set of spotless corporate coveralls that would be ruined by noon, carrying a dual-latch, military-grade aluminum case housing a state-of-the-art electronic diagnostic interface. It was a piece of tech that cost more than the pickup trucks his crew drove, featuring a high-res telemetry screen displaying real-time code feeds, aggressively marketed specifically to crack the firewalls on the newest generation of heavy agricultural armor that the old-school wrenches couldn't touch anymore. He had slowly circled the massive tractor with the predatory stance of a heavyweight sizing up a victim before the bell rings, his eyes running up and down the chassis with the cold, technical evaluation of a veteran measuring the metal against every beast he'd ever killed. He popped the primary access panel, jacked his proprietary cables straight into the motherboard's ports, and booted his diagnostic sweep with the smug efficiency of a king walking into his own castle. Helen had rolled out with the silver coffee tray right at 8:30. She poured for Sonia first, then for Charles, who was hovering nervously on the perimeter trying to look like the alpha male in charge of the crisis. When she offered a steaming mug to the mechanic, he just gave a dismissive jerk of his head without ripping his eyes off the glowing telemetry screen. She quietly placed the mug down on his heavy toolbox and pivoted back to her route, but she deliberately charted a path back to the house that dragged her within 2 feet of the tractor, not lingering, not staring, just close enough to rip a high-speed visual scan of the diagnostic feed scrolling across his screen. She captured exactly what she needed. The hours bled out with that agonizing, suffocating tension that builds when a guaranteed fix slowly mutates into a total nightmare. The mechanic aggressively swapped cables, executed hard reboot sequences, and made hushed, desperate phone calls to corporate engineers 3 states away, dropping his voice so the billionaire clients wouldn't smell the panic. Sonia paced through the courtyard 3 separate times, the intervals between her patrols getting shorter and more aggressive, radiating the toxic impatience of a narcissist watching her social timeline burn to the ground. By late afternoon, the mechanic violently yanked his cables out of the port with the aggressive jerk of a man officially surrendering the trench. He turned to Charles, his face hardened with the brutal honesty of a professional who has hit an impenetrable wall and would rather swallow his pride than lie about a resurrection. This system is European, completely armored. The master control module is running proprietary corporate encryption that my scanner cannot penetrate without a factory authorization key. He let the bad news breathe. You need a Tier 1 software engineer from the manufacturer with direct backdoor access. There is 0 chance of overriding this locally. Sonia had absorbed the entire execution from the veranda, gripping her iPhone, her face locked in the exact same toxic glare she had weaponized all day, the terrifying look of a tyrant waiting for a miracle and getting more psychotic by the hour when it doesn't arrive. She pushed off the massive wooden column and marched straight at the mechanic, her high heels stabbing the dirt in rapid, violent strikes, weaponizing her body language to broadcast pure aggression before she even opened her mouth. What an absolute waste of my time and my money. Her voice plunged into a freezing, dead calm register that was infinitely more lethal than a screaming fit because it was pure, concentrated venom. They promised me an expert, and they sent me a guessing amateur. The mechanic snatched up his heavy aluminum case without firing a single word back, carrying the ironclad dignity of a man who knows that engaging with a rabid dog is a losing game, and marched out the gate with his spine significantly more rigid than when he walked in. Helen quietly collected the cold, untouched coffee mug from the toolbox and ghosted back into the kitchen. The second operator rolled in the next morning. He was an old-school silverback with snow-white hair and massive hands that carried the deep, permanent grease stains of 40 years buried inside heavy engine blocks. Not the soft, manicured hands of a software guy, but the scarred paws of a mechanic who reads raw iron by touch. A guy who gauges operating temps with the back of his knuckles, who can diagnose a catastrophic cylinder failure strictly by the acoustic rhythm of the block, long before a computer sensor trips an alarm. He was the ghost the county called when the shiny tech guys tapped out, the absolute last resort before towing the rig to the scrapyard. And he carried the silent, heavy reputation of a man who didn't need to brag because his body count spoke for itself. He walked around the dead tractor infinitely slower than the first guy, dragging his calloused fingers across the chassis at hyper-specific stress points, like a blind man aggressively reading Braille in a language only he understood. He popped the massive hood and just stood there, staring deep into the engine bay for a long, heavy minute, without touching a single wire, locking into the posture of a master listening to the battlefield before pulling the trigger. Then he cracked the dipstick and smelled the burnt oil, checked the radiant heat on the headers with a bare hand, and physically traced the primary wiring harnesses from the visual ports deep into the black voids of the firewall. Sonia hovered aggressively in his blind spot, radiating a suffocating, toxic urgency, firing off rapid, badgering questions all afternoon, with the psychotic delusion that harassing him was somehow accelerating the repair. She snapped, asking if it was almost done. She demanded to know the exact failure point. She interrogated him about why it was taking so damn long. She aggressively challenged his competence, which he met with a massive, deafening silence that was infinitely more insulting than any comeback he could have yelled at her. Right as the sun started to drop, the old silverback slammed the massive steel hood shut with his bare palm. Not a frustrated slam, but the heavy, final thud of a judge dropping the gavel. This right here is a fried motherboard. He delivered the death sentence with the terrifying calm of a man stating an undeniable law of physics. I turn wrenches on heavy iron. I don't fix encrypted laptops. A short, brutal pause. Far as I'm concerned, it's dead in the dirt. He grabbed his faded work cap off the tire, pulled it tight over his white hair with the definitive motion of a man officially clocking out of a bloodbath, and walked out the gate with the exact same slow, untouchable dignity he walked in with. What exploded next was the catastrophic fallout of a sociopath losing total control in front of a captive audience. Sonia rallied the 13 mechanics who were still lingering in the yard, some who had just rolled up to pitch their own diagnostics, others who had been held hostage on standby in case the heavy lifting required a team, all of them shifting uncomfortably as the sun went down and the impossible reality set in. She planted herself dead center in the asphalt courtyard, arms aggressively crossed, her voice mutating from freezing ice into a shrieking public execution. Not a chaotic explosion, but a relentless laser-guided humiliation. She walked down the line, executing them one by one with insults engineered to inflict maximum psychological damage. She sneered at one guy, calling him a pathetic amateur. She looked another dead in the eye and said his framed shop diploma was bought out of a cereal box. She interrogated a third, asking if he learned how to hold a wrench by watching YouTube tutorials, because his actual competence was an absolute joke. The men stood there paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare with no clean exit. Firing back meant an all-out war with a billionaire, and that was a tax none of them had the bank account to survive. Charles desperately tried to kill the feed. He stepped towards Sonia, his hand weakly extended in the pathetic, pacifying gesture he had refined over 2 decades of surviving her psychotic breaks. Not a firm command to stop, just a weak, hovering presence begging for mercy. She snapped her head toward him, hitting him with a glare so violently toxic it didn't even require a single syllable to castrate him on the spot, and he instantly froze, dropping his hand like a coward. Helen was quietly clearing the dirty coffee trays on the perimeter of the kill zone. It was a physical task that required doing, and she was executing it flawlessly, but the energy radiating from her chair had fundamentally mutated. She was no longer cloaked in her survival invisibility. She was locked into a state of contained, lethal observation. It was the hyper-focused attention of an operator, witnessing a massive tactical error that mattered infinitely more than the ceramic cups in her hands. Sonia hit the end of the firing squad line and stood in the center of the yard, winding up for the massive sweeping kill shot she had been building toward all afternoon. It is absolutely mind-boggling how this entire pathetic town is infested with absolute incompetence. Her voice spiked into a sweeping, toxic generalization that completely nuked the entire working class. Worthless, useless trash. I have absolutely no idea why I even bother signing paychecks for your kind of people. And then she locked eyes with Helen. It wasn't a long, drawn-out stare down. It was a microsecond, laser-guided glance that carried the payload of a nuclear bomb. Because of its terrifying brevity. A look that violently dragged Helen into the execution without even bothering to say her name. The glance itself was the insult. A silent, psychotic declaration that Helen was the ultimate bottom feeder of this worthless trash category, radiating a disgust so pure it contaminated the air. Helen stared right back at her, not with panicked defiance, not with the rapid-fire twitch of someone who just took a bullet and is desperately trying to shoot back. She held her ground with that terrifying, absolute, dead calm focus she had maintained all day. The cold, calculating stare of a sniper who has watched the target make every single mistake and has finally acquired a solid lock. It is genuinely sickening to think that someone could look at another human being with that level of sociopathic disgust. Dragging a woman in a wheelchair into a public execution with a single, arrogant glare, treating her very existence on that asphalt as proof she was absolute garbage. If that kind of pure, unfiltered entitlement makes your blood boil, if you are 100% riding with Helen right now, smash that like button. That tap is your way of proving that her toxic glare didn't go unanswered. Because there was a massive, fatal blind spot Sonia had absolutely no idea about in that exact second. There was a hidden variable that none of those 15 mechanics knew, that Charles was completely oblivious to, that nobody in that entire compound had even bothered to question because they were all running on the same arrogant, toxic assumption. The assumption that the scarred hands carrying the coffee trays had absolutely nothing else to offer the world. And arrogant assumptions like that always carry a brutal, undeniable price tag. The bill was about to come due. The courtyard slowly bled out with the agonizing sluggishness of a crisis that ends in total failure. Not the rapid, efficient exit of men who solve the problem, but the slow, humiliating retreat of guys cutting their losses. The mechanics packed their heavy iron into their toolboxes with the quiet, defeated movements of men, trying to erase a bad day, exchanging silent, heavy side eyes that communicated deep blue-collar solidarity without needing a single word, and rolled out the iron gates with their pride severely dented. They knew they'd carry the ghost of that dead tractor until they cracked their next impossible block, which is the only way guys in that life balance the scales. Charles lingered in the yard long after the last truck's taillights vanished into the dust, his face locked in the desperate, calculating grimace of a CEO, watching a multi-million-dollar disaster violently expand beyond his control. The dead iron in the yard was a massive operational nightmare. The harvest clock was ticking, the logistics were bottlenecked, and the hourly cost of a dead mega-tractor was bleeding the ledger. But looming above all of that was Sonia's apocalyptic dinner party, which in her psychotic hierarchy of needs, violently eclipsed the actual agricultural survival of the estate. Sonia had stormed back into the sprawling mansion with the aggressive, jerky movements of a tyrant violently closing a chapter so she wouldn't have to look at her own failure. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a concussive blast that was completely unnecessary, weaponizing the wood to scream that she was totally washing her hands of the disaster, even if the bleeding hadn't stopped in the real world. The courtyard fell dead quiet, and Helen stayed exactly where she was. It wasn't some loud, dramatic movie hero decision. It was simply the heavy, undeniable absence of retreat. It was the raw immobility of an operator who hasn't finished dissecting the target. She sat parked right next to the massive multi-million-dollar machine, staring deep into the open engine bay the old silverback had left exposed. and the look burning in her eyes had completely mutated from the cold, tactical observation of the last 2 days. It had shifted into something infinitely older, far more dangerous and deeply personal. Her hand moved slowly. It was covered in the heavy, armor-thick calluses forged by manually shoving a metal wheelchair through the dirt every single day for years. Not soft palm calluses, but the brutal, jagged ridges on the base of the fingers and the flank of the thumb, exactly where the metal push rims aggressively bite into the flesh. She raised that scarred hand and pressed it flat against the tractor's inner cowling. Not the shiny, polished exterior armor, but the dark, heavy internal iron that absorbs the brutal heat of the engine block and radiates it like a furnace for hours after the cylinders die. The heat was still there. And bleeding through that physical, metal-on-skin contact came something that wasn't exactly a memory, but lived in the exact same neighborhood. The violent, electrical surge of a deeply familiar, intimate connection that had been locked in a dark box for way too long. Waking up with the terrifying, natural ease of a weapon that was never forgotten, just holstered. Her old man had been a hardcore, backwoods mechanic. Not the corporate kind who plugs laptops into rich people's toys, but the gritty, analog kind who keeps a starving farm alive by pure willpower. The kind of master who learns the soul of a machine because there is no backup plan, who dives so deep into the iron that he rewrites the factory manuals. He was a guy who barely spoke, but his silence demanded absolute attention. A man who taught by bleeding on the engine, not by giving lectures. She had grown up completely submerged in the roaring diesel fumes of the tiny dirt farm they survived on, absorbing a lethal mechanical genius, not in some sterilized classroom, but by pure, violent osmosis, watching a master dissect iron and mirroring his exact surgical strikes. Her dad always swore that every single engine on Earth had a voice. He said 99% of people are completely deaf to it because they're rushing, because the world is too loud, or because they're too arrogant to believe a hunk of steel has anything to say. But the operator who actually stops, shuts up, and truly listens, without ego and without a ticking clock, will find the exact bleeding artery before they even pick up a wrench. The catastrophic accident had happened 12 years ago. It was the kind of brutal, high-impact trauma that violently rewrites the entire geometry of a human life. Not just destroying what your body can physically execute, but infecting your brain with toxic limitations about what you believe you can execute, which is usually a far more crippling cage than the physical damage. She had spent the dark years after the crash grinding through a brutal, invisible psychological recalibration that nobody on the outside could ever comprehend. And somewhere in that dark tunnel, she had made the quiet, devastating choice to take her elite mechanical genius, lock it in a heavy steel box, and shove it onto a dark shelf, because the emotional tax of looking at it was simply too high to pay at the time. The engines had stayed on that shelf, but the massive iron beast was sitting right there, and the courtyard was completely abandoned, and her scarred hand was already gripping the burning engine block before her conscious mind could even attempt to hit the brakes. Helen smoothly rotated her chair, sliding down the flank of the tractor toward the secondary access panel for the electronic fuel injection grid. Not the primary high-level port the experts had been attacking, but the secondary low-angle access, a port that was perfectly, ironically accessible to a master sitting in a wheelchair, but would have required a walking man to contort himself in the dirt to reach. There was a dark, poetic justice in that geometry, but she didn't have the luxury of admiring the irony right now, because her brain was completely locked onto the kill. She reached deep into the inner pocket of her frayed apron and pulled out a heavy crescent wrench. It was ancient, the edges scarred with the dark, heavy oxidation that comes from years of sitting in the dark without enough oil. The kind of rough, ugly rust that doesn't compromise the lethal functionality of the steel, but screams that the tool has a body count. It had been sitting at the bottom of that hidden pocket for longer than she could even track, carried every single day out of the pure, paranoid survival instinct of a woman who hoards her most lethal weapons in the dark, because the visible weapons are the first things they strip from you when they decide you don't matter anymore. She went to work, her hands moving with a deliberate, terrifying slowness that wasn't born from hesitation, but from the icy, surgical precision that only unhurried confidence allows. Every single movement locked into its exact coordinate, her hands, which had lost some of their youthful speed, retaining a devastating, absolute exactness that raw speed usually destroys. That was the exact second Charles walked back out into the yard. He had stepped out of the mansion to grab something from the equipment shed and froze dead in his tracks, completely blindsided by the sight of his invisible house cleaner leaning halfway inside the multi-million-dollar guts of a machine that cost more than a city penthouse. He cautiously closed the distance, his steps hesitant, carrying the heavy fear of a man terrified of interrupting a bomb technician. "Helen." His voice dropped into the soft, hyper-cautious register you use when you're trying not to startle a sniper. "What exactly are you doing?" They all gave up. She didn't even flinch. Her scarred fingers kept moving, physically tracing the massive wiring harness with a blind, tactile memory that didn't need to be fast to be flawless. When she finally answered him, she didn't pull her eyes off the wiring block, splitting her processor perfectly, giving him exactly the audio response he needed without stealing a single ounce of focus from the kill zone. My father, back when I used to turn wrenches in the dirt with him, always used to tell me something. A heavy operational pause, not a theatrical one, just a breath to let her fingers work. "Helen, a farm tractor doesn't play games. The real cancer is always hiding exactly where the money refuses to look." Her fingers hit a specific node and froze for a split second, the intense, hyper-focused pause of an operator verifying a lethal hypothesis. "I just need 2 minutes." Charles just stood there next to her, completely paralyzed, having absolutely no idea if he should call security or just shut up and wait. He chose to shut up and wait. The heavy iron wrench found the master connector. It was a critical, low-angle junction for the electronic injection module that wasn't the first thing on the corporate troubleshooting list, and it wasn't the second. It was the exact kind of obscure, deeply buried fault line that you only find by ruthlessly hunting down the logic of the entire grid, rather than blindly following the shiny iPad manual. The corporate manual ranks failures by statistical probability, but statistics don't mean a damn thing when you're dealing with a specific bleeding machine that has its own unique, violent history in the mud. The connector was loose, not completely severed, just loose enough that the microscopic, intermittent vibration created the exact kind of ghost fault that multi-million-dollar diagnostic scanners flag as a symptom, but completely fail to trace back to the root, because the signal interrupts are too chaotic for the software to lock onto a pattern. She locked the iron jaws of the wrench onto the connector's locking ring, and applied the exact microscopic amount of torque required. Not a millimeter more, not a millimeter less. Just the absolute, perfect pressure needed to force the collar back into alignment until it hit home with the brutal, heavy snap that industrial-grade hardware makes when it finally locks into its true coordinates. The sharp metallic crack echoed across the empty courtyard with deafening clarity. Helen backed her chair away from the housing and methodically resecured the access panel with the 2 heavy bolts she had removed, spinning them in slowly with the exact same lethal precision she had used to pull them out. Then she dropped her hands into her lap and sat dead still, staring up at Charles with the serene, untouchable expression of a master who has executed the payload and is just waiting for the machine to confirm the kill. Charles climbed up into the massive cab wearing the terrified, desperate expression of a guy who didn't fully believe in miracles, but was completely out of options and had absolutely nothing left to lose. He violently twisted the ignition key. The massive diesel engine choked for a microscopic quarter-second, that agonizing, heart-stopping beat of hesitation right before the starter catches, and then it violently, explosively roared to life. It was the deafening, thundering, flawless scream of a high-displacement engine that suddenly has massive, uninterrupted access to fuel, air, and electronic fire all hitting at the exact same millisecond. A roar that is completely unmistakable to anyone who knows iron, and in the wake of 2 days of humiliating, dead silence, it sounded like an absolute atomic bomb of victory. Charles sat frozen in the captain's chair for a long, heavy minute, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his face completely blank as his brain desperately tried to process the reality-shattering event that had just occurred. He slowly looked down at Helen, parked in the dust right beside the roaring beast, her hands resting in her lap, gripping the antique crescent wrench. She was staring at the vibrating engine block with the quiet, deeply satisfied expression of a woman who just heard her favorite song play on the radio. His face was a chaotic war zone of conflicting emotions that usually don't exist in the same room. There was massive, explosive shock. There was raw, unfiltered awe. And buried underneath it all was the terrifying, crumbling realization that the entire foundational worldview he had been operating on was a complete, toxic lie. He was watching his arrogant assumptions get violently nuked by undeniable, hard iron evidence. Helen. His voice cracked, completely stripped of its usual wealthy corporate armor. "How did you..." She casually slipped the heavy wrench back into the deep hidden pocket of her apron, with the exact same fluid motion she had used to pull it out. No arrogant flexing, no cinematic victory pose, just the raw, simple humility of a master, returning a lethal weapon to its holster when the war is over. And she just looked up at him with a small, unshakable smile that didn't need the moment to be loud to know exactly how massive it was. The deafening roar of the massive diesel block violently rattled the walls of the sprawling mansion, announcing its resurrection with the aggressive clarity of a beast that doesn't need a formal introduction. Sonia burst out the side door, clutching a designer water bottle, her face instantly morphing into the hostile defensive mask of a tyrant bracing for the next miserable negotiation. She arrogantly assumed, running the logic of a woman who had spent 48 hours throwing money at a disaster, that one of the elite mechanics had slunk back onto the property, cracked the code, and was now firing up the rig to extort her for double the original quote. She was already mentally preparing to rip the guy's throat out over the invoice. She stomped down the veranda steps with the rapid, aggressive strike of a woman walking into a firefight she had already rehearsed in the mirror. And then she hit a brick wall of reality. There were no mechanics. The multi-million-dollar tractor was idling flawlessly, the pure, heavy rumble of a perfectly tuned engine dominating the courtyard, like the disaster had never even happened. And parked right beside the beast was a woman in a wheelchair, holding a rusted crescent wrench, wearing a frayed work apron sporting a massive, fresh black grease stain across the lap that absolutely had not been there an hour ago. Sonia's face violently cycled through a catastrophic system failure in the span of 3 seconds. The shocking collapse of her arrogant assumptions, the frantic, desperate scramble of her brain trying to invent a fake narrative to explain what she was seeing, and finally the toxic radioactive mutation of fear and confusion boiling over into the only emotion she actually knew how to weaponize: pure, unadulterated rage. Her arm holding the water bottle went dead and dropped to her side. "What the hell did you just do?" Her voice shook with the pathetic, cracking instability of a dictator trying to scream orders while the floor actively collapses under her feet. "How dare you lay your hands on that machine?" She took 2 aggressive, stabbing steps toward the massive tractor, her posture instantly shifting into that of a hostile auditor, hunting for a microscopic scratch she could use to execute a peasant. "If you broke a single wire on this..." Her pitch spiked into a frantic, hysterical shriek. "This is absolute vandalism. I will make you pay for this." Helen sat dead still, the wrench hidden in her pocket, her eyes locked onto Sonia with that terrifying, absolute dead calm focus she had weaponized all day. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't submissive. It was just the lethal, immovable presence of a master who knows exactly what she just accomplished and doesn't need a single ounce of validation from a parasite to know she won the war. The voice that violently sliced across the courtyard didn't belong to either woman. Charles swung down from the tractor cab with the heavy, undeniable momentum of a man who had made a blood oath decision before his boots even hit the dirt. There was a massive gravitational weight to how he landed, the deliberate, crushing impact of a king finally stepping back onto a throne he had abandoned for way too long. He was broadcasting a lethal authority before he even opened his mouth. "That is enough, Sonia." It was just 4 words, but they detonated with a terrifying, absolute authority that Sonia had clearly never ever heard from her husband. It wasn't the weak, pleading tone of a guy asking for peace. It wasn't a gentle, pacifying suggestion. It was the brutal, unyielding steel of a man who had swallowed his spine for 20 years, finally hit his absolute breaking point, and slammed the steel door shut permanently. Sonia choked on her next breath, her mouth falling open in pure, paralyzing shock. He slowly pivoted to face Helen. The way he moved in that second was excruciatingly deliberate. Slow, heavy, loaded with the massive, suffocating guilt of a man who is about to confess a sin he should have owned a decade ago, and knows it. His movement instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the courtyard, creating a terrifying, dead silence that Sonia's psychotic screaming could never achieve. Because this silence wasn't born from fear. It was born from the raw realization that something incredibly real and incredibly destructive was about to be unleashed. He stared deeply into Helen's eyes for a long, heavy beat before speaking. It was the look of a man who is finally seeing a human being who had been bleeding out right in front of him for 6 years, looking at her with the absolute, crushing respect she had earned the second she rolled onto his property. "I had absolutely no idea." He dropped the words with the raw, brutal honesty of a man confessing a cardinal sin, stripping away all the corporate spin and defensive bullshit. "He passed away 10 years ago, but I had absolutely zero idea that Anthony's daughter was scrubbing floors in my own house. The name hit the courtyard pavement like a live grenade. Anthony had been the absolute greatest master mechanic who ever turned a wrench for Charles's father. Not just the best in the county, based on some fake Yelp reviews, but the best in the concrete, undeniable reality of a man who kept a massive agricultural empire breathing fire for decades with a level of genius that doesn't come with a college degree, because it's measured strictly in survival. But during the golden years of the ranch, when Charles's father was building the empire Charles eventually inherited, Anthony had been infinitely more than just a guy on the payroll. They had forged a blood and sweat partnership, the kind of absolute old-school loyalty that exists in the deep country, where a man's word is worth more than a bank vault. And that ironclad loyalty had been officially recognized with a legally binding promise, locked away in a document, and buried in a dark filing cabinet where it was never found by the people who intentionally refused to look for it. Charles closed the distance to Helen. He dropped to the dirt. It wasn't some polite, aristocratic bow. He violently folded his knees into the dust, bringing himself completely eye level with the woman in the wheelchair, executing the deliberate, undeniable physical gesture of a man who understands that the conversation he is about to have requires absolute equality, and that forcing her to look up at him would be a final, unforgivable insult. "You are not a maid on this property." His voice dropped into the dead-serious, low-frequency register of a blood oath, spoken directly to her, ignoring the rest of the world entirely. "You are the legal heir to 30% of the acreage my father promised to yours." Sonia froze like she'd been shot in the chest. It wasn't her usual calculated power pose she used to project dominance. It was the total catastrophic paralysis of a parasite who just received a terminal diagnosis that completely incinerates the fake map she had been using to rule the world. Her entire toxic arsenal of weapons was instantly rendered useless, because the battlefield she thought she owned had just been ripped out from under her feet. Charles kept speaking without even glancing in her direction. "There is a bulletproof legal will." He delivered the facts with the icy, unyielding tone he had weaponized the second he stepped out of the cab, stripping away all the pathetic compromises and soft peddling he usually used to survive his wife's tantrums. "From my father, directly to Anthony, 30% of this entire estate, recognizing 30 years of a real partnership, even if it was never formally printed on a corporate letterhead." A heavy pause. "That document existed. I should have aggressively hunted it down the second Anthony died. I didn't." He stared deeply into Helen's eyes, his knees still buried in the dirt. "And because of my pathetic blind negligence, I allowed my wife to treat you like absolute garbage inside the very borders of an estate that rightfully belongs to your family." The words hit like sledgehammers, carrying the massive, undeniable weight of a truth that cannot be spun, mitigated, or excused. There is zero excuse for that. There is only owning it and fixing it. Helen held his gaze in total silence for a long, heavy minute. Her weathered face processed a violent storm of emotions in rapid succession. The shock that hadn't been fully anticipated even by a woman whose entire life was built on hypervigilance. The raw, bleeding emotion of hearing her father's name, spoken with absolute reverence by a man who truly knew his worth. And buried underneath it all, a massive, tectonic shift. It was the feeling of a universe violently correcting itself. Not just fixing a minor accounting error, but grabbing a derailed train and brutally slamming it back onto the tracks where it belonged all along. She looked down at the rusted crescent wrench still gripped in her lap. Then she looked up at the massive tractor, still roaring flawlessly in the background with the unstoppable rhythm of an engine that had found its perfect equilibrium and had absolutely zero intention of dying. And then, she slowly turned her eyes to Sonia. And the look she finally leveled at the woman who had tormented her was completely stripped of everything that came before. It wasn't the dead, submissive stare of a victim absorbing a beating because she had no exit. It wasn't the wounded, fragile dignity of a martyr suffering in silence. It was the complete, absolute, terrifyingly tranquil gaze of an apex predator who knows exactly who she is, what she owns, and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up to reality. Sonia involuntarily staggered backward a half step. The designer water bottle slipped from her manicured fingers without her even realizing her grip had died. The heavy plastic slammed against the asphalt with a hollow, pathetic thud. Sonia just stared down at it for a blank second, looking totally disconnected from reality, acting as if the falling bottle was some random glitch in the matrix that had absolutely nothing to do with the apocalypse happening around her. But it was everything. Charles pushed himself up from the dirt with the fluid, powerful motion of a man who has finished one execution and is immediately moving to the next target without taking a breath. He stood tall in the courtyard, radiating the massive ironclad authority he had forged in the tractor cab, a new, terrifying posture that Sonia was clearly still failing to process. It wasn't physically aggressive, but it was a solid brick wall of dominance that had been missing from their marriage for so long that its sudden reappearance was infinitely more terrifying than a screaming match. He turned his eyes on his wife, and they were dead cold. You just burned a small fortune dragging in arrogant mechanics who had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. He fired the words off with the icy precision of an auditor reading a bankruptcy file, not a husband having an argument. And while you threw your pathetic tantrums, the rightful co-owner of this dirt was mopping up our messes, pouring the coffee you drank without even looking at her, and swallowing insults that are going to haunt this courtyard long after you are gone. Sonia opened her mouth, her brain frantically spinning up the classic narcissist's defense matrix, desperately hunting for the spin, the fake angle, the perfect lie to reposition herself as the victim of a chaotic misunderstanding rather than the villain of the story. He completely suffocated her excuse before she could spit it out. You are going to apologize. He dropped the hammer with the absolute, non-negotiable finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. Right now, right here, in front of every single person standing in this yard. The ranch hands who had survived the 2-day mechanic circus were all hovering on the perimeter of the courtyard, not intentionally grabbing popcorn for the show, but paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the situation, freezing exactly where they were working when the atmosphere in the yard went nuclear. The groundskeeper was there, the afternoon shift driver, 2 harvest grunts who had clocked in early, and the head cook who had rushed out the back door when she heard the massive diesel engine roar to life, standing frozen on the steps, completely blindsided by the execution she was witnessing. Sonia's panicked eyes darted from face to face, desperately hunting the perimeter for an exit hatch, a friendly face, or an excuse to run. She found absolutely nothing but dead-eyed stares. Then she looked at Helen. The apology bled out of her mouth like pulling teeth without anesthesia. It carried the specific, toxic quality of a confession, extracted at gunpoint, completely devoid of the heat and crushing guilt of a genuine apology, dripping with the freezing, residual arrogance of a sociopath, saying the exact right words without feeling a single ounce of the remorse required to make them real. She choked out that she was unjust. She muttered that she had crossed the line. She forced out an "I'm sorry." Helen absorbed the pathetic display with a face carved out of stone. She didn't offer a polite "it's okay," because it absolutely wasn't okay, and handing Sonia a fake olive branch in that moment would have been a lie far worse than silence. She didn't scream that she'd never forgive her, because forgiveness is a private internal war that doesn't need a public press release to exist or fail. She simply absorbed the hollow words with the cold, calculating attention of a master receiving a flawed payment, reserving the absolute right to decide what to do with the trash on her own timeline. It was enough. Over the next 48 hours, Charles summoned the bulldog corporate attorneys he should have called a decade ago, back when Anthony died and the explosive will was shoved into the back of a dark filing cabinet where Sonia buried documents she arrogantly decided weren't worth her immediate attention. The will had been sitting there in the dark. It had been sitting there the entire time, waiting with the terrifying, immortal patience of a legal blood oath that doesn't expire, just waiting for someone to finally rip open the drawer. The 30% equity transfer was executed with the terrifying speed that millions of dollars can buy, when fueled by massive, crushing guilt. Helen sat across from the ruthless lawyers, still wearing her faded work apron, because she had rolled straight from her morning shift into the boardroom, and she signed the transfer documents with the heavy, ironclad signature of a woman who knows exactly how massive the paper is, and doesn't need to fake a celebration to prove she owns it. The total overhaul of the estate's financial management was the immediate next step. It wasn't a pity play or a sentimental handout. It was the cold, hard, rational move of a billionaire who had watched a ghost in a wheelchair outsmart 15 mechanics in 2 minutes, and realized he was personally squandering a genius-level asset, a failure he now found deeply personally humiliating. He offered her the keys to the kingdom, laying out the raw numbers and the massive responsibilities. Helen accepted the throne, but only after slamming down her own set of non-negotiable demands, the exact kind of ironclad terms dictated by an apex operator who knows her exact market value and doesn't need anyone's permission to wield it. A massive storage suite adjacent to the main executive wing was entirely gutted, repainted, and custom outfitted with a heavy mahogany desk and an ergonomic workstation perfectly calibrated for a wheelchair's clearance, down to the exact millimeter. The first morning Helen rolled into that office was a seismic shift, not because the workload was different, but because the entire trajectory of the universe had flipped. She was rolling into her own empire, not ghosting through a room where other people played God while she picked up their dirty cups. Sonia physically remained on the estate. She stayed because Charles had drawn a brutal, microscopic line between the toxic mistake and the human being who made it, and decided to honor that line even when it was excruciatingly hard to stomach. But her reality had been violently, permanently downgraded. She was completely stripped of her blank check platinum cards, stripped of the authority to bark orders at the staff without routing it through the new managing partner, stripped of the power to move a single dollar without a counter-signature. She made the fatal mistake, deep into the second week, of trying to ambush Helen in the hallway, aggressively lecturing her about how a specific vendor contract wasn't up to the elite standards of the estate. Charles happened to be standing in the doorway. He calmly stated with that same terrifying, icy brevity he had weaponized in the courtyard, that all vendor relations and financial architecture were the exclusive domain of the managing partner, and that if Sonia had a critique, she could submit it to him in writing for formal review. Sonia spun on her heel and walked out of the room without a single word. The ensuing months cemented the new empire. Not the toxic dictatorship fueled by screaming tantrums, but a ruthless, hyper-efficient machine built on actual, undeniable competence. The ranch accelerated into the harvest season with the massive tractor roaring flawlessly, governed by an administration that made lethal decisions based on hard math, verified against the physical dirt of the operation. It was the exact kind of hardcore, reality-based leadership the estate had desperately needed for a decade, even if Charles had been too blind to admit it. There was an ancient, rusted-out tractor rotting in the back of the equipment shed that hadn't fired a cylinder in years. It was the very first heavy iron Charles's father had ever bought, abandoned in the dark when the shiny new tech arrived, left to die because the massive mechanical overhaul required to save it was deemed way too expensive for anyone who didn't have a personal blood tie to the machine. Helen carved out the time to resurrect it. It became her obsession, a dark hours side project executed when the executive wing was locked down, and the courtyard was bleeding with that rich, heavy sunset light that makes old rust and grease look like gold. She rebuilt the beast slowly, methodically, using her own scarred tools and a few pieces of heavy iron she borrowed from the shop, tapping into the massive mechanical genius she had kept locked on a dark shelf for 12 years, waking the monster up with the terrifying natural ease of a weapon that was never forgotten, just waiting. When she finally dropped the wrench, the ancient beast roared to life with the deafening, thundering voice of 40 years ago. Now I want you to think about something before you answer. If you were standing in Charles's boots, after witnessing that absolute massacre in the courtyard and uncovering the twisted truth, what would you have done with Sonia? Would you have given her a second chance, betting that harsh reality can force a toxic person to mutate and change? Or would you have thrown her off the estate permanently, knowing that some lines, once crossed, poison the well forever? Drop your verdict in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you would play it. The final image burned into the history of that ranch was the courtyard at dusk, bathed in that heavy, golden hour light of the deep country that a camera lens can never truly capture. Helen was sitting tall right next to the resurrected iron beast, no longer wearing the frayed, grease-stained apron, but a sleek custom leather jacket she bought with her very first executive paycheck, not to flex on anyone, but for the pure, undeniable thrill of wearing armor she actually chose. The shoulders that had been hunched over in defeat that day in the dirt were squared off and locked at the exact altitude of a conqueror. The worn metal rim on her chair had been replaced with flawless, brand-new steel. She hadn't miraculously forgiven Sonia in some weak fairy tale sense of erasing the bloodbath, because true forgiveness doesn't work like that and never has. She simply reached an absolute, untouchable altitude where Sonia's toxic existence didn't even register on her radar anymore. She had shoved the villain into a dark box of irrelevance, acknowledging her as a pathetic ghost of the past that had absolutely zero power to dictate her future. Her ultimate revenge was setting her alarm for 4 a.m. out of pure, aggressive ambition, not desperate survival. It was the massive steel beast she had resurrected with her bare hands, roaring under her command. It was the corner office with her name forged on the door. It was breathing the absolute bulletproof peace of a woman who knows exactly who she is, what she's capable of, and exactly how much she's worth. This story aggressively proves that true, undeniable power never belongs to the loudest narcissist screaming in the yard. It belongs to the ghost in the corner, the one who is silenced, ignored, and shoved into the dirt, who quietly stockpiles a lethal mastery that cannot be bought, stolen, or thrown in a dumpster. Arrogant bullies build their castles on thin ice, and when that ice violently shatters, real competence doesn't need to beg for a microphone. The execution speaks for itself. If you believe that raw, humble expertise will always nuke arrogant entitlement, and you love stories that remind us exactly who we need to be when the universe tests our spine, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next bloodbath of justice. We'll see you in the trenches.